In this recording, we are going to talk about the different features of informational books, and the information here will help you select quality informational books for your classroom. So when we talk about informational books, what we mean are books that include information about the real world. For example, they might describe an event in history, or they could describe a scientific phenomenon. I'm actually, in this recording, I'm going to be using this book, Neighborhood Sharks by Catherine Roy, as an example of an informational book. As the title probably communicates, this is a book about white sharks that live off the coast of California, so we're going to be referring to it a lot in this recording. So typically with informational books, what we tend to see is general statements made about the topic. Here's an example from Neighborhood Sharks that I wanted to share with you. White sharks are the largest living predatory fish in the ocean, growing up to 21 feet long, 8 feet wide, and sometimes weighing over 4,500 pounds. So I would consider that to be a general statement about the topic, because we are talking about white sharks in general. We're not talking about one specific white shark. So that's something that you often see in an informational book. Also, informational books are usually written in the present tense, but of course the exception to that would be books about historical events. We often see those written in the past tense. And informational books are usually organized according to different types of text structures. So a text structure is a way that the author chooses to organize information in the text. You might think of it as a pattern of the way the book is written. And oftentimes informational books will incorporate multiple types of text structures. And you are going to learn more about text structures when you take 407. I'm just going to give you a really cursory overview of the different types here. So a sequential or a chronological text structure describes events in the order in which they occurred. So if you were reading a science book about how a seed grows into a plant, you would expect that kind of book to be written in a sequential text structure. You would expect to hear about all the different steps that that have to occur for a seed to become a plant. A cause and effect text structure is when the author talks about an event that happens and then what the effect of that event is. With problem solution, the author poses a problem and then describes some solutions to that problem. With a compare-contrast text structure, the author is pointing out the differences and similarities between two people or two objects or two animals or whatever the topic is. A descriptive text structure is generally, that one's hard to identify, but if your text structure isn't one of these other ones, it's probably descriptive. A descriptive text structure simply describes or explains about the topic. And then we also have the question-answer text structure, in which the author poses a question and then provides the answer. I have a book at home that's a really great example of this. It's called If You Sailed on the Mayflower, and it's about what it would be like if you were traveling from England to Massachusetts in the 1600s. And with that book, at the top of every page, the author puts a question, and then the text below the question actually answers the question. So that one's pretty straightforward. So now we're going to talk about some features that are specific to informational books. Well, I should say most of them are. A table of contents is something that you're likely to find in works of fiction, like I think Al Capone Is My Shirts, which we read earlier in the semester, includes a table of contents. So that's not unique to informational books, but many of these other features are. So front matter, that's information that you are most likely to find in the front of the book. So a table of contents is really important because, as you may already know, sometimes readers will pick up an informational book and not necessarily want to read the whole thing. They might just want to look for a specific subtopic within the book. For example, if I have an interest in sharks, but I already know a lot about sharks and I really just want to learn more about what sharks eat or a shark's habitat, I might use a table of contents to help determine whether or not the book I have in my hands will address the topics of what a shark likes to eat and a shark's habitat. So a table of contents can be really useful to help readers decide whether or not they want to seek out information in an informational book. The copyright date is also something that is important to look for, because as you might be aware, our understandings of history change over time, and we are also making scientific advances all the time in our society. So therefore, information in informational books can become outdated rather quickly. So you want to make sure that the copyright date of the informational books you select for your classroom are fairly recent. And there's no hard and fast rule about how old is too old for an informational book, but you do have to keep in mind what you really need to do is look over the informational book and decide whether the information is still current or not. As an example, I was in a teacher store several years ago, and I bought a book about the planets, and it was by Gail Gibbons, who's a really respected and well-known author of children's informational books. And I bought the book because I thought it would be useful for my classroom. It tied into my curriculum. And then when I got it home and I started looking at it, the book had Pluto listed as a planet. And I realized the copyright date of the book was 1992, I think. And as we know, in 2006, Pluto was demoted from planet status. So that's just a pretty prime example of why it's important to check copyright dates before you purchase or select nonfiction books for your classroom. So within an informational book, there are a number of different text features that we are likely to find. One text feature would be headings and subheadings, and headings and subheadings are used to organize the text and to signal to the reader that the topic is going to be shifting. So it kind of gives the reader a heads up, hey, we're going to be talking about a new topic here. I really like Neighborhood Sharks, the book we've been discussing in this video, because it has a heading at the top of almost every full page spread. For example, some headings include high definition vision, and as you might imagine, that page talks about how sharks see, like what are the different parts of their eyes. The following page is endless teeth, so as you can probably guess, that page is all about a shark's teeth and how their teeth are really conducive to preying on other animals. So oftentimes with informational books, we also see an emphasis of key vocabulary words, especially scientific words that children might not necessarily be familiar with. And sometimes we see those in italics, and sometimes we see them in bold print. And oftentimes authors of informational books are courteous and will define what those words mean within the context of the book itself. So they'll explain what the vocabulary word means in the sentence in which it's used. Sidebars are also commonly found in informational books, and sidebars are generally convey information that is ancillary to what is being communicated in the main text. So for example, a nonfiction book that I read recently called The Industrial Revolution for Kids had a number of sidebars and kind of told or gave some information about famous people of the Industrial Revolution that weren't part of the main body of the text. Oftentimes with informational books, we also see captions and labels that go along with visuals. Like if an informational book has a photograph, we want to look for a caption that explains what the photograph is depicting. So when you don't see that, it's a little bit disconcerting because you're not really sure exactly what it is you're looking at when you look at the photograph. And informational books also include a number of different types of visuals. So sometimes they include photographs, other times they include illustrations. And that might be surprising that they include illustrations, but like Neighborhood Sharks is an example of an informational book that is illustrated. Those are, I think, watercolors that the author illustrator used. Also, we sometimes see diagrams in an informational book. We also see timelines that show a sequence of events. Other times we see maps to give us a sense of where in the world the topic of the book is located. For example, in Carcapo Rescue, Saving the World's Strangest Parrot, that's about parrots that live in New Zealand on just a couple small islands off the main parts of New Zealand. So this map with this inset is really helpful to get a sense of where in the world these parrots actually live. So this summer I actually worked with a group of children at a public library in the South Mississippi area, and I read Neighborhood Sharks with them. And one thing that I noticed that I want to tell you about is that when you are reading nonfiction with children or selecting nonfiction books for your classroom, you need to be careful about visuals that are overly stylistic or a little too artsy, that aren't like clear cut and straightforward. For example, with neighborhood sharks, we see this image here. It's kind of it's a diagram of a shark's eyeball. And if you look at this picture, you can see that the eyes are actually looking at an eye chart, what looks like a doctor's eye chart. And this was really confusing to the children that I read the book with, because even though they were familiar with eye charts from, getting their eyes examined at school with the school nurse, they were really confused by this. They understood that these were eyes, but they were confused by the fact that the author included animals in the eye chart. That was just something that they couldn't really figure out, and it actually led to a lot of confusion. As an adult reader, I understand that the author is trying to say, like, well, these are the types of animals that a shark is likely to see or that a shark is likely to hunt. And it's cute, but, for the children I worked with, this was really confusing. So even though I like the content of this book, it might be one that I'd avoid, because I think that it's got great information, but it could be confusing to them as well, unless some of these visuals are explained to them clearly. This was another one that confused them. Here we see a diagram of a shark that's being compared to an airplane, because just like a shark's body, or just like an airplane is able to lift itself out of the air, a shark's body is designed with fins like an airplane in order to lift itself up out of the water so it can hunt its prey. But this was really confusing to the students. They were like, why would the author do that? Like, sharks don't fly. Sharks are too heavy to fly. And they just didn't really understand the analogy the author was trying to make. So I think that perhaps, the author might have done better to just include a very straightforward illustration or a straightforward diagram of a shark's body with some labels, rather than trying to make the analogy between a shark and an airplane, which was confusing to children. Also, back matter is something that we want to look for. A glossary is like almost like a built-in dictionary in the back of the book, and it includes key terms that might be potentially unfamiliar that are included in the book itself. Also, an index is something that we want to look for, because sometimes we want to just see if a book addresses a particular topic. So if we flip to the index, we can easily find out whether or not a book addresses the topic that we are interested in learning about. And then we have the bibliography, and bibliographies are extremely important to look for when you select nonfiction books for your classroom, because the bibliography tells you what sources the author used to do his or her research, and that's really critical with an informational book. So if an author doesn't include a bibliography, or the author's bibliography looks very weak, like the author just used like Wikipedia for a source, that's really bad. You want authors that have meticulously researched their subject matter. So you want to make sure that authors are including quality sources in the bibliography, like journal articles or books by experts on the subject matter. All right, so I'm going to stop there. If you have questions about informational books, let me know.